Welcome to the Deep Dives, where we take the world's most confusing, sprawling source material, slice it into perfectly digestible insights, and give you the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed.
Our mission today is, well, it's deceptively simple. We're here to uncover the surprising origins of the most routine parts of modern life, the systems, the laws, the habits we utterly take for granted.
Yeah, because we tend to think of our civilization as, planned, scientific, rationally designed by really smart people for maximum efficiency.
Right. But the sources we've collected today, and it's a fascinating deep stack covering everything from medieval street cleaning to Roman laws on purple stripes, they reveal a much messier, more compelling truth.
The truth that suggests that modern organized life, the kind that actually works, often results not from careful foresight, but from sheer, unadulterated medieval panic. We're basically living in a civilization built on historical trauma.
It's true. We have two seemingly separate stacks of material here, but they share a core logic of control. The first stack details how these desperate, improvised emergency fixes responses to plague, fire, famine became permanent policy.
So the birth of things like quarantine, bureaucracy, urban planning.
Exactly. And the second stack is all about how power and identity were dictated entirely by appearance. We're talking clothing, tattoos, and reputation.
And we're going to culminate that section with the incredible story of Anne Boleyn, a woman whose refusal to follow the rules literally broke a nation.
And the underlying connection, the core thesis for you today is this. When chaos strikes, society's first instinct is always to create systems of control, whether it's a physical wall for a quarantine or a symbolic stripe on a toga.
These brutal, improvised measures became the permanent, predictable backbone of modern life.
That's the idea.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting where medieval improvisation met existential disaster in the choking, crowded streets of 14th century Europe.
We begin with public health and really just the absolute blinding necessity of survival. The concept of quarantine, that 40-day isolation period, was, according to all the documents we reviewed, absolutely not invented by doctors or scientists.
No, it was invented by exhausted, terrified port city officials. I'm thinking places like Ragusa, Venice, who were just staring at a city full of corpses and saying, all right, this is an unacceptable statistical pattern.
Right. They had no idea about germs, no microscopes, but what they were brilliant at was pattern recognition, especially when the stakes were, half your population dying.
And that pattern was horrifyingly consistent. A ship arrives from an infected port, trade resumes, everyone's happy, and then boom. Within a couple of weeks, people start coughing in a way that signals the city's about to go into a terminal decline.
The simple, brutal realization was the disease didn't exist here until the ship showed up. And that desperate act of observation linking cause, the ship, to effect mass death was, kind of by accident, the very beginning of epidemiology.
So the mechanism they came up with was just medieval in its bluntness, delay everything.
Exactly. Ships were ordered to anchor offshore. Travelers were kept outside the city walls, sometimes on remote islands. Goods were fumigated or just left untouched for weeks, as if the disease would get bored and leave.
But the 40-day period, where did that come from? It wasn't even 40 days at first, was it?
No, the sources suggest it started at 30 days, a Trentino in Venice. But they realized 30 wasn't quite long enough for every case to show up, so they extended it to 40, a quarantina.
But why 40 specifically? It feels symbolic.
It wasn't scientific. First, historians think it was just long enough for someone to start looking suspiciously unwell, which is a grimly practical timeline.
And the second.
The number 40 has huge biblical significance. 40 days and nights of the flood, 40 days of Christ's fast. It felt authoritative. It gave this desperate measure a kind of divine weight.
And the key is, it worked. Not perfectly, but often enough to break the cycle.
It did. And you have to imagine being quarantined then. You weren't necessarily sick. You were just untrusted, lonely, bored, stuck in some makeshift building far from anyone you knew.
But that miserable existence gave the city the illusion of control, which slowed panic. And sometimes it gave them real results. And what started as this desperate, arbitrary, let's just wait, became tradition, then law.
And that medieval improvisation is now the backbone of modern public health policy 800 years later.
That same panic-driven logic fueled the first real sanitation efforts. Medieval cities didn't start cleaning streets because they cared about aesthetics.
Not at all. They invented it because, and I'm paraphrasing the urgency in the municipal records, the accumulated filth of the street began to smell like a permanent, unmissable warning sign of impending death.
Before the plagues, streets were just dumping grounds for everything. Household trash, butcher scraps, animal waste. It was staggering.
And the plan was basically that rain would wash it away, which of course it never really did.
So then the outbreaks come, and officials notice this really persistent pattern. The neighborhoods that are literally drowning in waste are also the ones filling the graveyards the fastest.
They didn't understand germ theory, obviously. They had no idea about invisible vectors of disease. But they absolutely understood the correlation. The filth and the death arrived together.
So the response was fear-fueled and incredibly aggressive for the time. Emergency hygiene orders, fines, digging gutters.
And crucially, moving all that waste away from where people lived, usually into rivers or pits outside the city walls.
So let's be clear, this wasn't modern environmentalism.
Oh no, they were just relocating the problem, often downstream to the next town. But the point was, it wasn't here anymore, and the areas that got rid of the waste saw fewer, less severe outbreaks. The smell got better, people stopped dying quite so fast.
And once something lowers the death rate, even a little bit, it tends to stick around.
And quietly evolve. Emergency cleanups became routine. Gutters evolved into sewers. Modern sanitation systems descend directly from medieval officials screaming, "Get rid of that pile of rotting matter before we all perish."
So cleanliness in this origin story is purely about survival, not pride, not aesthetics.
Pure survival.
And once they contained the physical chaos of the streets, they had an even bigger mess to clean up.
Yeah.
The chaos of the state itself. Which brings us to something we all love to hate, but is just as foundational: bureaucracy.
Right. And our sources make it so clear. Bureaucracy wasn't invented because medieval rulers loved forms or the quiet joy of alphabetical order. It was invented because during emergencies, wars, plagues, everyone started just shouting at once and the state just seized up.
When disaster hit, governments faced the terrifying realization: if nothing was written down, reality itself became optional. Verbal commands, which rely on memory and stable messengers, they just collapse in chaos.
Exactly. Suddenly you have endless arguments over who owes taxes, who owns what land, who's next in line for the throne. It multiplied faster than any disease.
So officials reached for the most powerful tool they had: ink and parchment.
And suddenly lists appeared. Detailed ledgers. Properties described in exhausting detail. This wasn't administration for efficiency. It was pure, desperate panic management.
So something like tax records. After a plague, how does the king know who's even alive to pay taxes or who owns what land now?
He doesn't. Relying on local gossip is impossible. So census records emerged, not out of a deep care for demographics, but because rulers needed to know exactly who was left to keep the state financially stable.
So the medieval clerk, sitting in a tower with ink-stained fingers, is basically an emergency worker.
He's the ultimate emergency worker, preserving order while the physical world outside falls apart. And even though people hated the new rules and the confusion, bureaucracy had one unbeatable advantage. It worked when everything else stopped working.
But didn't this create a whole new set of problems? I mean, the critique of bureaucracy now, as then, is that it's slow, arbitrary, and restrictive.
That is absolutely a valid critique, and it emerged almost immediately. But the historians confirm that once the emergencies passed, the paperwork didn't disappear. It was just too useful.
It stabilized markets, it reduced fights over property that could escalate into real violence.
And it provided a permanent record that survived the lifetimes of individual rulers. So, reluctantly, bureaucracy became permanent. Every permit, every license, every government form you fill out traces its lineage back to a time when rulers realized that yelling orders into a terrified crowd only produces more yelling.
Chaos demands documentation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And speaking of chaos, let's look at the law itself. For a long time, medieval law was customary law, or, less formally, whatever the loudest, most powerful local lord remembers.
Which works fine until a crisis hits,
Yeah.
and then justice just drowns under panic and conflicting claims.
Verbal law is just too flexible. During riots or famines, people argued endlessly over their rights and exemptions. Local power mattered more than standardized justice.
So authorities came to a very modern conclusion. Ambiguity is dangerous. Written laws appeared because ambiguity led to uncontrollable social friction during a crisis.
They were carved into stone, copied into books, posted in town squares, and this was a revolutionary shift. Authority moved away from unreliable memory and toward permanent, visible text.
The law became colder, harder to negotiate with.
Which was exactly the point. Predictability mattered more than tailored perfection. Written laws allowed cities to function by standardizing punishments. Curfews were enforced consistently. Legal arguments got shorter because the source material was fixed. Modern legal systems rely entirely on this medieval realization that writing survives panic.
The need for a coordinated response also led to something truly revolutionary, born of pure frustration: standardizing time itself.
Think about it. Before this, noon happened when the sun felt like it was roughly overhead. It's a personal opinion. That's fine for farming, but it's a huge liability when you need to coordinate a defense or a fire response or distribute emergency food.
The records are full of chaos caused by bad timing. Guards arriving late to their shift during a siege, markets opening at different times, causing riots when starving people showed up too early.
Exactly. Meat at dawn is useless if dawn means something different to everyone. So they made standardizing time a necessity for survival.
And the technology for that was the church bell.
Church bells became the backbone of time discipline. They rang at set, fixed, communal intervals, imposing consistency on everyone. Mechanical clocks followed, often inaccurate, expensive things, but they did one thing much better than the sun. They were consistent.
And consistency was everything in an emergency. It allowed for reliable shift changes, scheduled markets, standardized curfews.
People hated it. It felt intrusive to have your day carved up by noisy, arbitrary bells. But time discipline, once it was established, never left. It was just too useful for management. It didn't make life happier. It made life controllable.
And the last huge piece of this medieval panic management that structures our lives is urban planning and fire codes. Basically, trauma response as architecture.
Medieval cities were architecturally accidental, and that combination of wood, thatch, narrow streets, and wind was, as one source put it, a perfect partnership dedicated to total urban destruction. A single spark could erase a neighborhood.
After rebuilding the same city for the third or fourth time, authorities finally concluded, maybe this keeps happening for a reason. And that reason is how we build.
So emergency rules followed, born of utter trauma. Thatched roofs were banned. Stone, brick, and tile were required, even though they were incredibly expensive.
And most importantly, buildings had to be spaced apart. Mandatory setbacks. Not for aesthetics, but to stop fires from leaping across the alley.
People hated the rules, of course. Stone construction was costly. Giving up valuable real estate was deeply resented.
But the fixes worked. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Fires still happened, but they didn't consume entire cities with the same enthusiasm. This was the genesis of fire breaks, modern building codes, and zoning.
Later, new towns used grids instead of winding alleys. They created open spaces as communal fire breaks. Modern zoning, building permits, traffic flow, it all traces back to the desperate realization that chaotic cities collapse faster under pressure.
Urban planning didn't make cities pleasant first, it made them survivable.
Exactly. Which brings us to our next section, where we look at how society started managing the consequences of disaster, scarcity, and contagion. And the core principle remains absolute control over resources and people.
Let's start with rationing. Probably the most universally unpopular policy of all time.
And rulers didn't invent it because they enjoyed telling people no. They invented it because emergencies, wars, sieges, harvest failures had a habit of turning full granaries into empty promises overnight.
Initially, cities tried optimism. They asked people to be reasonable.
And the historical outcome of voluntary restraint when facing starvation is always the same. Instant, aggressive hoarding. Prices exploded. Fights broke out in markets over grain that wasn't even there anymore.
And the sources show that grain shortages caused riots faster and more violently than almost anything else. Governments learned very quickly that hungry crowds stop respecting authority.
So authorities stepped in with the least popular solution imaginable: strict regulation. Rationing meant limits on purchases, fixed prices, set amounts of bread. It required more bureaucracy born of panic.
And it wasn't fair in a modern sense. The elite still got more.
No, but it achieved the existential goal. It delayed disaster. If everyone got a small, predictable allowance, fewer people starved immediately and panic slowed. Survival required imposed restraint.
The sources note that when resources shrink, unregulated freedom collapses faster than state regulation ever does.
It's a grim but realistic logic, and it extends directly to emergency stockpiles. People learned that we'll figure out later was a strategy with a high body count. So they built granaries for grain, armories for weapons. These weren't signs of excess. They were scars from previous disasters.
Stockpiling was controversial, though, right?
Yep.
Rulers were accused of hoarding, driving up prices.
Immensely controversial. It was a politically difficult necessity. But when a siege hit, the reserves mattered. Cities lasted longer. Panic slowed because people knew verified supplies existed.
It's the same logic as modern strategic reserves. Petroleum, food, medical gear?
Exactly. They aren't built out of optimism. They're built out of absolute realism. Prepare now so we don't panic later.
Now let's manage the people themselves. Starting with the curfew. Medieval societies learned a simple truth the hard way. Nothing good happens after dark.
Nighttime turned mild problems into full disasters. Darkness multiplied fear, obscured vision, and allowed chaos to spread.
So they introduced the curfew. The couvre-feu, cover the fire.
Enforcement was immediate. Evening bells rang, signaling people to damp their hearth fires and stay put. City gates closed. Guards questioned anyone on the streets.
This wasn't about morality, it was about containment. Fewer people moving meant fewer problems spreading. Fires were easier to spot. Crime was suppressed.
People hated it. The night represented freedom, privacy, but it worked. Cities with enforced curfews had fewer disasters. Authorities restrict movement not because people are evil, but because panic spreads faster in the dark.
That same chilling principle of containment, rather than cure, drove the initial development of hospitals.
Healing was often optional, if not impossible. Containment was the non-negotiable goal. When plagues hit, officials needed a place to put the ill, the injured, and the highly contagious.
So hospitals were more like strategic relocation centers, often outside the city walls, downwind, and remote locations.
This was triage on a societal scale. By concentrating the sick in one place, the rest of the city could keep functioning. Markets stayed open, guards stayed healthy.
So being sent to a hospital was less like receiving care and more like being exiled. You were publicly branded as a threat.
Precisely. It was grim, but it worked just enough to matter. Cities with containment spaces saw fewer uncontrolled outbreaks. Death became organized instead of chaotic, which, in that context, was real progress. Over time, knowledge accumulated, and they shifted from isolation centers to places of treatment.
And finally, managing competence. For a long time, if someone claimed they knew how to do something, that was good enough, until the crisis hit.
During emergencies, that optimism collapsed. Untrained doctors killed patients. Unqualified builders built houses that collapsed. Incompetent bakers caused mass illness.
When survival depended on critical skills, you couldn't just trust people.
So guilds were formed, not as social clubs, but as damage control mechanisms. If you wanted to practice a trade, medicine, construction, baking, you had to prove your skill.
Licensing was about reducing casualties, not promoting excellence. Medical licensing started to stop people from experimenting on their neighbors during plagues. Building standards emerged after too many shelters collapsed. But didn't those guilds just become self-serving monopolies, restricting entry to control prices?
That tension was absolutely present. They were fiercely protective of their turf. But the sources show the initial motivation was survival. The public benefit of reduced casualties was tangible. Cities with regulated trades had fewer catastrophic failures.
So once authorities saw that, licensing became permanent.
And modern professional certification, permits, quality control, it all descends from this medieval realization. Letting untrained people practice critical skills during a crisis is a spectacularly bad idea.
Okay, so we've established how medieval necessity and survival created our literal infrastructure. Now let's explore another form of control, one based entirely on how you look.
This is a fascinating transition in the logic. Society first imposed physical control on the body quarantine, curfew, but then it sought to impose symbolic control on status itself. In Roman and Tudor society, your identity was not internal, it was enforced through appearance. Your clothing was a visual legal document.
Take purple in ancient Rome. This wasn't just a color, it was authority made visible. True Tyrian purple dye from thousands of crushed sea snails was so rare, so expensive it screamed power.
Because of that, purple became the ultimate legal instrument for social sorting. Roman laws carefully dictated who could wear it and how much. Senators got a narrow purple stripe on their tunics, equestrians a thinner stripe.
And full purple garments were reserved only for the emperor. Wearing too much purple without permission wasn't just a fashion mistake, it was treason. It implied you were claiming imperial legitimacy.
Which Rome had zero tolerance for. What's also fascinating is the dye itself. It often looked dull in poor light, but in the bright Roman sun, it would glow crimson. Wearing purple was a performance. It had to be seen and recognized.
Then there was a huge moral panic over silk. When it arrived from the East, so expensive, so light, often see-through Roman moralists saw it as moral corruption you could drape over your body.
Right. Traditional Roman clothing, heavy wool, was designed to conceal the form, to reinforce seriousness. Silk clung, it shimmered. Critics complained it was clothing that does not hide the body or even one's decency.
So they passed laws to restrict it, especially for men who were accused of abandoning masculine virtues.
And this highlights the deep Roman hypocrisy. The same senators passing these laws often owned and wore silk privately. Wearing it in public became an expensive test of nerve announcing you could afford not only the fabric, but the criticism that came with it.
And then, the ultimate marker of citizenship, the toga. Massive, cumbersome, heavy wool, and compulsory for male citizens.
It was a terrible garment for daily use, hot, heavy, awkward to drape. It restricted movement. You had to constantly be aware of your posture to keep it from slipping off.
And that was intentional. It forced you to move slowly, deliberately, with dignity. You had to suffer for your status.
Exactly. A plain white one for adult men, a purple-trimmed one for boys and magistrates, and the most famous, the agonizingly white toga candida for political candidates who had to rub chalk into the wool to make it blindingly white to symbolize purity.
Roman politics was literally a whitening contest.
Citizens hated it, but law and tradition kept it alive. Not wearing it meant stepping outside the social and legal order.
This legal sorting went right down to their shoes.
It did. Footwear was a loud declaration of status. Closed leather shoes for citizens. Slaves went without. Senators wore distinctive black leather shoes with crescent ornaments.
Disgraced individuals could be legally forbidden from wearing proper footwear. A public humiliation.
And for respectable women, there was the stola, a long draped dress reserved exclusively for married women of unquestioned virtue. It was a badge of honor, signaling protection.
But it was also a leash. Prostitutes were forbidden from wearing it. Adulteresses were legally barred from it forever. A permanent punishment that announced their shame to everyone they met.
Now we move from removable fabric to the ultimate permanent declaration, the tattoo. Here, the laws are written directly onto the body.
And unlike clothing, tattoos couldn't be removed when circumstances changed. They were a language written in flesh.
Look at Polynesia. Tattoos were a sacred act, an inheritance. The word tatau means to strike, a reminder that the marks were earned through agonizing, years-long rituals with bone chisels.
The body became a genealogical record. Chiefs wore the most complex designs, mapping bloodline and ancestral deeds. An unmarked body was socially marginal.
Contrast that with the Scythians of the Eurasian steppes. For them, tattoos were elite insignia reserved for power. They depicted predatory animals, stags, cats' visual biographies carried in the flesh.
In a world without written records, your body told your story.
And in ancient Egypt, it's another story. Tattoos there were tied to protection, healing, and fertility, worn mostly by women. Dots and dashes on the abdomen and thighs acted as permanent amulets against the dangers of childbirth.
So the tattooed body became sacred ground, armored against misfortune.
Then you have Rome and Greece, where the meaning flips entirely. Tattoos were not marks of prestige, they were marks of control and disgrace. Ink on the body meant you had lost something fundamental: freedom, honor, legal standing.
They used them to mark slaves, gladiators, criminals, often on the face, so the shame followed you everywhere. The state was asserting absolute control.
A tattooed elite was unthinkable because power was supposed to be transferable, refined, not fixed permanently onto your skin.
And finally, the indigenous Americas, where tattoos were a record of achievement. You weren't tattooed for who you were born as, but for what you had done.
Exactly. Marks could signify enemies defeated, wounds survived. The body became a living ledger of experience. You couldn't fake it. In all these cases, the body was converted into a document demanding accountability. Appearance was law.
So we've explored how panic creates systems and how visibility enforces status. Now, let's use the dramatic story of Anne Boleyn to see what happens when one person's ambition, fueled by calculated appearance and refusal, forces a change in those systems of control.
Anne Boleyn was not some political novice. She was trained for this, spending her formative years in the sophisticated French court. She learned restraint, wit, and most importantly, how proximity to a monarch worked. She came back to England visibly different.
Her critical moment, the one that triggered the crisis, was her strategic refusal. Henry VIII was already involved with her sister Mary. Anne understood that becoming another royal mistress was short-term favor and long-term ruin.
She refused to play that expected role. She didn't reject the king, which would have been reckless, but she controlled access. She insisted she would not surrender without marriage, turning Henry's desire into a protracted, all-consuming obsession.
This was revolutionary. Kings were used to demanding and receiving, not being denied for years.
She shifted the balance of power. She also positioned herself not just as temptation, but as an intellectual and religious partner, a legitimate future wife. By refusing to be discarded, she forced Henry to imagine a future that required discarding his queen of 20 years, Catherine of Aragon.
And that personal refusal set history, law, and religion in motion.
Henry's desire put him in an impossible position. He needed an annulment, but the Pope refused. Catherine was the aunt of the most powerful ruler in Europe, Charles V.
So this private marital dispute became a full-blown constitutional crisis.
For years, Henry tried to get papal approval. Anne, trapped in this limbo, kept amplifying reformist religious ideas that offered Henry a radical way out. The idea that kings answer directly to God, not Rome.
The solution was to shatter the system entirely. Henry used Parliament to declare himself supreme head of the church in England, severing obedience to Rome.
And the English church was born not of theological purity, but of desperation, desire, and immediate political necessity.
So Anne was finally crowned queen, wearing the crown of a new, rebellious kingdom. But her legitimacy depended entirely on two fragile things: Henry's volatile favor and the survival of the religious break she had helped justify.
She was at the center of a revolution she couldn't possibly control, resting on very unstable ground.
And security never materialized. From the moment she was crowned, her value narrowed to one thing: produce a male heir. She delivered Elizabeth, a healthy daughter, but the disappointment was immediate and dangerous.
A daughter only postponed the problem. Subsequent pregnancies ended in tragedy, including the loss of a male fetus, which many saw as divine judgment. Each failure, each whisper against her, grew louder.
Her enemies multiplied, and Henry's affection, the engine of her rise, cooled entirely. The final miscarriage freed him psychologically to seek a third queen.
And the stage was set not for a divorce, but for a swift, comprehensive legal assassination. This wasn't an emotional breakup. It was a calculated state action orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell to erase the problem cleanly.
They moved quickly, constructing charges with chilling efficiency: adultery with multiple men and the lethal charge of incest with her own brother.
The charges were implausible, but perfectly useful. Treason, sexual betrayal of the king was the unavoidable verdict, ensuring a swift execution.
The arrest and trials were staged, a terrifying piece of state choreography. Tudor justice wasn't about proof, it was about outcome, and demonstrating the king's unchallenged supremacy.
Anne denied the charges fiercely, but her testimony didn't matter. She was condemned within weeks. The chilling speed of her fall is what makes it so disturbing. Proximity to power, her greatest asset, became her ultimate liability.
Her death was swift, by sword, a staged mercy. But the execution, designed to erase her, couldn't erase the consequences of her life.
The religious break remained. The English church did not return to Rome. The precedent of royal supremacy was solidified, and forced decisions that permanently altered England's identity.
And the most significant unintended consequence was her daughter, Elizabeth I.
Raised in the terrifying shadow of her mother's execution, Elizabeth learned the vital lesson Anne never mastered. Survival requires profound restraint.
She inherited Anne's intelligence, but learned to cloak her ambition in patience and ambiguity. She succeeded where Anne could not by rejecting her legacy, but by surviving it.
Anne's impact, even in death, was permanent. She showed that even though the system of control, the law, the church, the king devoured her body, it could not undo the constitutional change her life and her refusal had set in motion.
So the two threads of this deep dive medieval crisis policy and symbolic control of identity are connected by this relentless drive for order.
Exactly. Our reliable, predictable systems, from clean streets to written laws, are not the result of thoughtful planning. They are, in essence, monuments to panic. Chaos doesn't lead to sustained anarchy. It leads to immediate, necessary policy that hardens into law.
And even the grandest historical narratives, like the English Reformation, hinge on those systems of control. In Anne Boleyn's case, one woman's refusal to comply with the rules forced a king to shatter centuries of tradition just to exert control over his own desire.
In both the medieval health codes and the Roman sumptuary laws, we see the absolute priority of control over chaos, visibility over ambiguity, and permanent documentation over unreliable memory.
So here is a provocative thought for you to carry forward. Every single modern convenience, from a building permit to a clean sidewalk, exists because someone centuries ago panicked and decided that order, however arbitrary or annoying, always beats the alternative. Given that, what fundamental rules are we inventing right now during our own modern crises that will seem totally inevitable to people 500 years from now?
Something to chew on. Thank you for diving deep with us.
We'll see you next time.